Sony ZV-1 features a 1-inch 20-megapixel CMOS sensor, 24-70 f1.8 2.8 lens, 315 autofocus points, built-in ND filters, the same autofocus system of A7R4. It records 4K 30 fps, Full HD 120 fps, slow motion up to 1000 fps. The camera's got S-Log2, S-Log3, HLG picture profiles. The camera uses the same small battery from the RX100 series and it costs $750. This is my first point-and-shoot camera in a really long time. Having used all the mirrorless cameras and DSLR cameras, all the professional big bodies, this feels like a toy in my hand. The grip is non-existent, almost non-existent, but it's not a complaint. I'm just telling you how I feel, that's it. And this is a pocket-sized point-and-shoot camera, so that is expected out of this. One amazing feature we all waited for a really long time is the flip-out screen. This saves a lot of hassle in checking the composition, the settings and the exposure and all those stuff when I do my YouTube videos, or when there is a need to look at myself while doing videos. This comes in really handy. I totally love it. I've been waiting for this feature for a really long time, and ZV-1 is first of the Sony cameras to bring the flip-out screen. Now A7S III has it, so I think this is the future. I think this is what Sony cameras are going to be in the future. And also, there is no viewfinder on this camera, so a lack of viewfinder can be disadvantageous when you're shooting in bright daylight. So the screen is not all that bright for really bright sunlight. A viewfinder could have been really good, but they had to place a huge mic here. So I think they just compromised the viewfinder for this large microphone here. The lens on this camera is a 9.4 to 25.7mm lens, but the 9.4 is not a fisheye lens or an ultra-wide lens. The crop factor on this camera is 2.8 because it only has a 1-inch sensor. So 2.8 times 9.4 is 24 and 2.8 times 25.7 is 70. So the full frame focal length equivalent of this camera is 24 to 70. And the aperture on this lens is 1.8, 2.8. Also, if you convert that to full frame equivalent, it would be around f5 to f8. In order to get the same image from this camera, you need to set f8 on a full frame camera if you're using a 70mm lens. If you're using a 24mm lens, you need to set your aperture at f5 to match the same image. So the depth of field is not shallow like a full frame camera. It's a 1-inch sensor, so you can't expect too much depth of field, but it does what it does. It's really good. However, the 1.8 to 2.8 is still the same light gathering capability. So you can match the exposure settings of a full frame camera with this camera and still have the same exposure. The full frame camera will have a much shallower depth of field, and this will have a deep depth of field, if you will. Video autofocusing speed. When it's set to fast, it's actually quite snappy, too fast for my taste. The normal autofocus speed is slightly faster than normal, I think, what I consider normal. So the speed could have been a little bit slower for the normal, and the slow is way too slow for any cinematic rack focusing. So I think the normal speed should have been somewhere between normal and slow. That's where the normal is, that I think normal should be. Apart from that, the autofocus is quite snappy. It's just no hunting at all, just snaps to focus, that's it. It's very confident. When it comes to photography, I have absolutely no complaints. There is no update for the ZV-1 RAW files yet, so I haven't tested the RAW files, but the JPEG images are so sharp and clear. It even allows me to do some levels of editing. If you want extra dynamic range, you can also bracket your photos. The low light capabilities on this camera is pretty decent for a 1-inch sensor. If you expose the subject properly, and if you don't mind deep blacks in the shadows, it does a pretty good job. The camera packs a ton of dynamic range for a 1-inch sensor. I don't know if that matters really, but the camera can shoot in S-Log2, S-Log3 and HLG. It's just fantastic. And my favorite is the HLG3 Hybrid Log Gamma 3. And it is amazing actually. You can pull a lot of information from the highlights and from the shadows, and it's so easy for grading, and the base ISO is way too low than S-Log2 or S-Log3. And the standard profile is very much usable actually speaking, but you need to expose it properly. The dynamic range on the standard profile is very slim, very slim. The camera has absolutely no problems identifying the faces. The auto exposure for the faces work like 90% of the time, and Also, the exposure handling, like bright to dark and dark to bright, is all handled so smoothly and gracefully. You don't see any abrupt changes in brightness. The face exposure is so well handled in this camera. When backlit, the camera works like 70 to 80%. I wouldn't say all the time it works, but 70 to 80% of the time it just exposes properly for the face. But I have seen a few times the camera really failed to expose properly for my face and I was in total darkness and like silhouette. My favorite picture profile is the Cine 4, and it also comes with the S Gamut 3 Gamma. So that's more than sufficient for me for most of the cases. But if your scene needs a lot of dynamic range, you can also use the S-Log 2, S-Log 3 and Hybrid Log Gamma, which actually has a little bit more latitude than the Cine 4. But for my use, I find the Cine 4 as the sweet spot. The high frame rate slow motion is solely for fun in this camera. Even in great light, there is a lot of color noise. So I don't think you can use it in a professional environment. But if you desaturate the image, it looks really good. That's it. So you can use the high frame rate slow motion in maybe black and white, and it gives out a really good picture. It's not sharp or it's not pretty detailed, but I think you can have some fun with it. The built-in ND filters are really good in this camera. It is a highly welcomed feature after RX 100 series. I think RX 100 Mark V had the built-in ND filters, and after that it did not. None of the cameras had ND filters built in. But this camera has brought back the ND filters, and it's so handy because you don't have to fiddle around with the step down rings, step up rings, the color casts and white balance issues, and also jammed ND filters in front of the camera. Nothing of the sort. The built-in ND filters are so clean, and it also cuts down 3 stops of light. You can actually have a good shallow depth of field even in bright daylight, and it also helps you maintain the shutter angle when you shoot videos in bright daylight. Many a time we reviewers need to show you the products up front like this. So we need to hide our face so the product gets focused. But in this camera, you can just show it like this. You don't have to hide your face. No finger focusing or no face focusing, eye focusing, nothing of the sort. So you just need to turn on the product showcase feature in this camera. Just show it anywhere. So I think the camera just focuses on the closest subject, and it's really handy. You don't have to fiddle around. You don't have to close your face completely to have anything focused. That is so good. The 4K image from this camera is so clean. It is really good. It has a good bit rate for a 1-inch sensor, and it's really clean. Fantastic. In broad daylight, it just kills it. Built-in stabilization, so IBIS. Sony cameras usually don't have a really good IBIS. This camera has 2 settings in it. One is the standard, one is the active. The standard is the standard IBIS that we all sort of like. So the electronic stabilization, which is the active stabilization, is really good, but it gives you a 10% crop, so mind it. So if you're vlogging with active profile, this could be a problem for you. The bokeh button now. On a single press of the bokeh button, the camera opens its aperture to the maximum and changes all of the settings to match it. So you can get a good background blur, background separation, and then it's really handy. It doesn't care about the shutter angle and all those stuff, but it does a lot of things that make your image more pleasing than before. So single press of the button just blurs out the background. That's really nice. The ZV-1 has 3 levels of skin softening: low, medium, high. I don't really have an opinion on that because I don't use it quite often, or I never used it actually speaking. But some people could benefit from that. I don't know, but I don't have an opinion on that. Vlogging. This camera is advertised as a content creator's camera or a vlogger's camera, right? But to start with, this camera has a 24mm to 70mm lens. Let's talk about the 24mm side. In my opinion, the 24mm is already a tight focal length, okay, for a vlogging camera. If you are vlogging in 4K, you already have a 1.1 crop, which makes it 26.5mm lens. And if you turn on the active stabilization, because the standard stabilization is not all that great, it also adds another 10% crop, so making the lens a 30mm lens. You start with a 24mm, you turn on 4K, you turn on active stabilization, you end up with a 30mm lens. Without doing anything, you're losing 6mm. So I think if the camera had about 20mm to start with, that could have been a fantastic ballpark for the vlogging style. Or you need to have a really long selfie stick, you can get away with it, but it is a hassle. So The camera could have had a wider lens, but it did not. So that's another problem in my opinion. The camera uses the same NP-BX1 battery from the RX series. The RX cameras are so not friendly with this battery, but this camera does so well, surprisingly, with this battery. With normal usage, the battery lasts more than an hour. For 4K recording, I had 45 minutes of continuous recording and still had 1 bar left in the battery. So this battery does so well with this camera. This combination is so good. Things that I don't particularly like about this camera. The camera could have benefited from a bigger battery, slightly bigger battery, maybe a bigger grip, bigger battery, maybe. The tripod head is not in the middle. Usually it goes right beneath the lens, the center of the lens, but the tripod has an offset about 5 to 7 centimeters, at least 5 centimeters, which makes it difficult for the composition and all the stuff sometimes. And also, the battery door is in a weird position, so if you are mounting the camera on a tripod, you can't access the battery door, you can't access the memory card, you can't swap the batteries. So those kind of weird design issues are there with this camera. The lack of fully functional touchscreen in this day and age is not acceptable anymore. Almost all the cameras have a fully functional touchscreen. This camera does not. And also the menu system from the old Sony cameras. The new A7S III menu system is really promising, and I think this camera can be enabled with a fully functional touchscreen and the new menu system with a firmware update. Because this is a partial touchscreen, you can use the touchscreen for just autofocus purposes. But if a firmware can update it or upgrade the camera to a fully functional touchscreen, that is more than welcome. Overall, I love this little camera. It's perfect for travelers, for family portraits, family pictures, just capturing the moment kind of thing. I love to shoot my beauty shots with this camera for a couple of reasons actually, which I'll share in a different video. I hope this video was useful to you in some way, and I will meet you in the next video. Until then, bye-bye.